The quiet rhythm of the afternoon in the office of Barnaby Jones was gently interrupted by the ring of the telephone. Betty picked up the receiver with her usual professional demeanor, speaking clearly into the mouthpiece, asking if she may help the caller. She paused, listening for a moment, before turning toward the inner room. Someone wanted to speak with big cousin Barnaby, and as she looked up, she wondered aloud if that could indeed be the person on the line. Barnaby smiled, noting that there was only one of his relatives who ever called him by that particular name. He took the phone, his voice warm with immediate recognition. He asked if it was his little cousin Monroe calling all the way from Chicago. The voice on the other end responded with energetic confirmation. Monroe explained that he had finally made it to Los Angeles and had just stepped off the plane. Barnaby expressed his complete surprise, asking why Monroe had not let him know earlier that he was coming. Monroe explained that the trip had come about rather suddenly. He revealed that he had gotten a lead on the man who had shot his partner 6 years ago. Barnaby recalled the history of that case, mentioning that he thought the Chicago Police Department had given up on it long ago. Monroe admitted that the department had indeed set it aside, which meant he was out here entirely on his own time. He suggested that he should first get situated in a motel and then give Barnaby a call later, so they might get together. Barnaby would not hear of such a thing. He insisted that Monroe was not going to stay at any motel and that he would be his house guest for as long as he wished to stay in L.A. He asked Monroe to specify which airline he had flown in on so he could head right over to pick him up. Monroe mentioned he came in on a Transcon flight and agreed to meet Barnaby right out in front of the terminal. Barnaby promised to be right over, hanging up the phone with a sense of wonder, reflecting that he had not seen his little cousin in 20 years. He turned to Betty, asking her to proofread a file for him, and mentioned that he would be back in a little while before heading out the door. Meanwhile, in a crowded public area, a man named Tony Ritter approached Monroe with obvious urgency. Monroe reacted with sharp annoyance, asking Ritter what he was doing there and why he had shown up. Ritter insisted that he needed to speak to Monroe immediately, suggesting they get out of the crowd because there were too many people around. Monroe questioned why Ritter was being so hard-nosed all of a sudden, reminding him that they were supposed to be on the same team. He told Ritter to turn around, reminding him of their agreement. Monroe explained his understanding that Ritter was supposed to help him find the guy who killed his partner, and in exchange, Monroe was supposed to get Ritter squared away with the parole board back in Illinois. Monroe expressed his extreme dislike for plans getting switched around, noting that they were scheduled to meet later that day at a location Monroe himself had carefully chosen. Ritter attempted to explain his panic. He stated that he had been following Cahill ever since he had phoned Monroe earlier. However, Ritter believed that Cahill had spotted him. Monroe looked at Ritter with deep skepticism, calling him a real loser and asking if he had somehow managed to get Cahill running again. Ritter denied this, explaining his terrifying realization that Cahill was actually following him instead. He described seeing a suspicious car parked outside his place the previous night and again that morning, leading him to conclude that he was actively being tailed. Tragedy struck shortly thereafter in the shadows of the airport grounds. By the time Lieutenant Joe O'Mahony arrived at the scene alongside Barnaby, the area was cordoned off. The lieutenant checked the victim's identification, confirming that he was Sergeant Monroe Jones of the Chicago Police Department. He looked at Barnaby, asking if the victim was indeed his relative. Barnaby confirmed that Monroe was his cousin, adding that he had talked to him on the phone not 20 minutes prior to the incident. The lieutenant expressed his sincere condolences, asking if Barnaby and Monroe were very close. Barnaby reflected that while they only saw each other once in a blue moon, Monroe was family. He noted that Monroe had been a dedicated street cop in Chicago for over 20 years and wondered aloud how a tragedy like this could have happened to him. Lieutenant O'Mahony pointed out that because Monroe could not carry his firearm aboard the commercial airplane, he had packed it inside his suitcase. The gun was still sitting right there in the open luggage. It appeared to the investigators that Monroe was desperately trying to reach for his weapon when he was shot. The lieutenant added that there were no witnesses, as nobody in the crowded area had even heard the gunshot, leading them to believe the killer had utilized a silencer. He asked Barnaby if he had any idea what this targeted killing was about. Barnaby shared the brief detail Monroe had given over the phone, explaining that his cousin had come out to California still searching for the person who had murdered his partner 6 years ago, and it now appeared Monroe had finally located him. The lieutenant stated that he had better get on with the formal investigation, prompting Barnaby to ask what specific task lay ahead. The lieutenant grimly answered that he had to make the difficult call to Monroe's son, admitting he would rather take a physical whipping than make a telephone call like that. Sometime later, back at Barnaby's private investigative agency, Betty was handling the phones when a young man burst through the door with intense determination. He asked the receptionist if Warner was in. Betty tried to stop him, but the young man brushed past her into the inner office. Betty followed quickly, apologizing to Barnaby and explaining that she could not hold him back. Barnaby gently reassured Betty that it was completely all right. He looked at the young visitor, recognizing him despite the passing of time, and greeted him as Jedediah, Cousin Monroe's boy from Chicago. Jedediah acknowledged the greeting, noting that it was probably surprising to see him there in Los Angeles so quickly. He asked Barnaby if anyone expected him to sit back home on his hands while the man who murdered his father was running around loose. Barnaby replied softly that he knew Jedediah would never do such a thing. Jedediah spoke with heavy emotion about his father, noting that the man had not taken a single vacation in over 10 years, ever since Jedediah's mother had passed away. Then, all of a sudden, his father had received a phone call, and the unresolved case of the man who blew up his partner drove him to travel across the country on his own time, only to end up killed. Jedediah looked around, asking if everyone was all right, though his tone was laced with bitter grief. He declared that he himself would only be great once the man responsible for this was nailed. He then directly confronted Barnaby, pointing out that 7 hours had passed since his father was murdered, and from where he stood, it looked as though Barnaby was just sitting around his office, not doing anything about it. Betty immediately stepped in to defend Barnaby, asking Jedediah to hold on. She pointed out that while she realized he was deeply upset, his accusation was neither fair nor true. Barnaby raised his hand gently, telling Betty it was fine, and that he could speak for himself. He gestured to the paperwork on his desk, explaining that he was actually just going over a specific file. Jedediah leaned over to look, asking what the file was. Barnaby explained that it was the official Chicago police file regarding the shooting 6 years ago in which Monroe's partner had been killed. Jedediah was surprised and asked how Barnaby had managed to obtain such documents so quickly. Barnaby noted with a subtle smile that he had twisted a few arms and a few rules to get it. Jedediah nodded grimly, recalling that his father had an enlargement of that exact case photo on his desk both at the police station and at home. He remarked that finding Cahill had really been an obsession for his father. Jedediah offered to help fill in any narrative gaps between the events of 6 years ago and the present moment, promising to tell Barnaby anything he needed to know or find out whatever he could. He then offered a sincere apology for charging into the office so aggressively. Barnaby put him at ease, stating that everyone was naturally wound up about the tragedy. He suggested that it might calm their nerves a bit if they went out to get a bite to eat, assuming it was not too early for Jedediah. Jedediah agreed, noting he was still operating on Chicago time, and the group prepared to head out. Meanwhile, in a tense corner of the city, Tony Ritter was frantically placing a call from a public payphone. When the line connected, he identified himself urgently to his brother, Richie. Richie answered, surprised to hear from him. Tony explained in a panicked voice that he was facing major problems and needed a big favor right away. Richie reminded Tony that he did not need to ask for favors like a stranger, emphasizing that they were brothers and promising that whatever he had was Tony's for the asking. He asked what Tony needed. Tony instructed Richie to meet him immediately at the exact place where they had met on Saturday night. Richie agreed without hesitation, stating he was on his way, and asked if that was the entirety of the favor. Tony said he would explain everything in person, but warned Richie to be absolutely certain that nobody was following him on his way there. A short time later, Barnaby and Jedediah were sitting in a quiet diner. Jedediah ordered just a simple hamburger, staring down at the table. He shared that when he first received the news about his father, he felt as though someone had kicked him right in the gut, and the painful sensation had not faded. Barnaby offered warm comfort, telling Jedediah that he simply had to give himself time to heal. Jedediah nodded distantly, changing the subject to his career path. He mentioned that he had graduated from law school and was currently preparing to take the bar examination. He then pushed to get down to business, asking how much detail the Chicago police report contained regarding Walter Cahill. Barnaby reviewed the facts, explaining that according to the report, the last time anyone had seen Cahill was when he was fleeing from an underground parking garage of a Chicago Loop hotel after shooting and killing a police officer. Cahill had escaped with $500,000 worth of high-value diamonds stolen from a jewelry salesman. Barnaby observed that even after fencing those stolen gems for a fraction of their value, Cahill would have ended up with a substantial enough stake to disappear completely, relocate to a new area, and establish an entirely new identity for himself. Jedediah asked if Barnaby truly believed Cahill had successfully pulled off such a transformation. Barnaby admitted that was precisely what he would have done if he had committed such a crime against a police officer. Jedediah reflected on his father's relentless mindset, noting that Monroe had never truly forgiven himself for not sticking by his partner's side on that fatal night 6 years ago. Barnaby pointed out what the official record stated. Monroe had only returned to the patrol car to radio for backup units because he knew Cahill was still hiding inside the hotel building. Jedediah acknowledged that truth, but emphasized that his father still carried the internal blame regardless. That guilt was the driving force behind his endless search for Cahill, a pursuit that Jedediah used to consider somewhat irrational until now, when it had officially become his own personal crusade. He then asked Barnaby what specific lead had brought Monroe out to Los Angeles in the first place. Barnaby explained that it involved a small-time criminal named Tony Ritter, who had jumped bail back in Chicago. Monroe had received a phone call from Ritter the previous night. Ritter had known Cahill from their past dealings, and he offered to point out Cahill in Los Angeles if Monroe agreed to use his influence to clear up Ritter's standing with the Illinois parole authorities. Jedediah asked what else they knew about Tony Ritter. Barnaby noted that the immediate priority was simply locating Ritter, as he was the key link who could lead them directly to Cahill. Jedediah remarked that finding Ritter sounded simple enough. Barnaby cautioned him, warning that while finding Tony Ritter might prove manageable, everything that followed could prove far more complicated and dangerous. Across town, Richie Ritter arrived at the designated meeting spot to find his brother Tony waiting nervously. Richie asked what